Part 4 of The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Pinner, told from the view of Nella and Eliza. Just as Nella promised, the coaches began running again at daybreak. We took the first one back to London, empty except for us two ragged, dirty travelers and our filthy linen sacks full of beetles, many of which were still alive and nearly suffocating in their tightly tied bags. Neither of us said much on the journey. For me it was due to fatigue. I had hardly slept a minute, but Nella had slept well. I knew, for she snored loudly most of the night. Perhaps she remained quiet due to the embarrassment at all that she had revealed. Her love for Frederick, the baby out of wedlock, the terrible loss of it. Was she ashamed that she had shared so much with me, who she meant to send away and never see again? The coach dropped us off at Fleet Street, and we made our way to Nella's shop along the mud-packed street, passing a bookseller, a printing press, and a stay maker. I read a window advertisement for a tooth extraction, 3 shillings, including a complimentary dram of whiskey. I cringed, averting my gaze to a pair of young women in pastel morning gowns floating past, their pale faces heavily rouged. I caught the edge of their conversation, something about a lacy fringe on a new pair of shoes, and noticed that one of the women held a shopping bag. I glanced down at my own bag, full of crawling creatures. The importance of our impending task grew terror inside of me. Purchasing the eggs for Mr. Amwell had not scared me like this. A woman would not question a young girl with eggs. But now, a quick glance at our linen bags would reveal an odd sight indeed, and would surely prompt questions. I, for one, did not have an explanation prepared, and I resisted the urge to look behind me at the cobbled lane, lest someone followed on our heels. The likelihood of detection must have been a heavy burden. How did Nella carry the weight of it each day? We continued to walk quickly, stepping around the tied-up horses and scurrying chickens. And I had little else to do but fear imminent arrest, and I forced my feet forward. At last we arrived at the shop, and I had never in my life been so grateful for an alley empty of all but shadows and rats. We slipped into the storage room, made our way through the hidden door, and Nella immediately set a fire. Lady Clarence was to arrive in half an hour, and we hadn't a moment to waste. The room warmed in minutes, and I let out a sigh, grateful for the heat on my face. Nella removed turnips and apples and wine from her cupboard and placed them on the table. "Eat," she said. While I dug in hungrily, I continued to toil about the room, pulling out pestles and trays and buckets. I ate so quickly that a terrible stomachache began to spread its way across my belly. I leaned forward, hoping to hide from Nella's ears the rumbles and growls coming from within me, wondering for a moment perhaps if she had poisoned me. It would, after all, be a convenient way for her to get rid of me. Panic rose within my chest as pressure inside grew, but the feeling released with a belch. Nella threw her head back in laughter, the first time I have seen real cheer in her eyes since the moment we met. "Feel better?" she asked. I nodded, stifling my own giggle. "What are you doing?" I asked, wiping a bit of apple from my lips. She had taken a hold of one of the beetle bags and now shook it forcefully. "Stunning them," she said, "or at least those that are still alive. We'll pour them into this bucket first, and it's not easy reining them in if 100 angry beetles try to crawl out at once." I grabbed the other bag, mimicking her actions, and shook it with all my might. I could hear the bounce and the fall of the insects inside the bag, and in trust I felt a bit sorry for them. "Now pour them in here." She slid the bucket towards me. With her foot, carefully untied the strings at the top of the bag. Gritting my teeth, I opened it. I had not yet a clear look inside the bag, and I dreaded what I might find. I estimated half of the beetles to be dead already. They lay there like pebbles, with their eyes and tiny legs, and the other half showed little resistance as I poured them out, their greenish-black bodies tumbling into the tin bucket. Nella poured her bag in next, then lifted the bucket and walked to the hearth, setting it on top of the roasting rack over the fire. "Now you roast them? Is it that simple?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not yet. The heat of the fire will kill the remainder of them, but we cannot roast them in this bucket, or we will find ourselves serving up little more than beetle stew." I cocked my head, puzzled. "Stew? Their bodies have water inside them, just like you and me. Now, Elsa, you have worked in the kitchen. What would happen if you put a dozen fish into a small pan over a fire? Would the fish on the bottom be crispy and flaky, as your master might have liked?" I shook my head, finally understanding. No, it would be soggy and wet. And could you imagine turning a soggy and wet fish into powder? At my grimace, she went on. "So it is with these beetles. They will steam if dumped in all at once. We will roast them on a much larger pan, only several at a time, to ensure they are crispy and dry." Several at a time, I thought to myself, and more than 100 beetles? That may take as long, if not longer, than the actual harvesting of the silly things. And after they are crispy, one by one we will grind them up with a pestle until the powder is so fine you would not know it from water. "One by one," I repeated. "One by one, which is why Lady Clarence best not return a moment too soon, as it will take us every last second to finish the task." I recall the moment when Nella threw her beetle powder into the fire, causing an eruption of green flame. What nerve it must have taken to throw over a day's worth of work into a blaze. Until now it had not been clear to me just how strongly she felt against murdering the mistress of a lord, how strongly she resisted aiding in the death of a woman. I imagined the tediness of the day ahead and willed myself to be cheerful about it. Nella had told me that she did not want me at the shop after this chore was completed, but perhaps, if I performed it well, she would change her mind and permit me to stay. The idea of it energized me, because the hot crimson bleeding of my belly had finally ceased, leaving it in its wake a rust-colored shadow, and this could mean just one thing. Mr. Amwell's spirit had decided to make its way out of my body and lie in wait for me. But where? There was only one sensible place, the place where he knew I would soon have to return, the lonely Amwell estate on Warwick Lane. Oh, how I would rather have stayed and roasted 1,000 beetles than step foot back into the dwelling place of my dead master. Who knew what ugly form he would take next? With 12 minutes remaining until Lady Clarence's arrival, a terrible storm was unleashed outside, but we hardly noticed it, for both of us were bent over mortar bowls, grinding the beetles as finely as we could. If Nella intended to send me away before Lady Clarence's return, it must have been a distant thought by now. It would have been impossible for her to finish the task without my help. With 6 minutes to go, Nella asked me to choose a vessel. Any appropriately sized jar would do, she insisted. She remained head down, eyes focused, and sweat on her forearms as she ground the beetles loudly against the mortar. At 1:30, Lady Clarence arrived, not a tick of the clock late. No pleasantries were exchanged upon her arrival. When she stepped into the room, her lips formed a tight line, and her shoulders were pulled taut. "You have it ready?" she asked. Rain droplets slid down her face like tears. Nella swept underneath the table, while I carefully poured the remainder of the powder into a sand-colored earthenware jar I had found in the lower cabinet. I had just finished securing the stopper, and the cork was still warm from my fingers when Nella answered her. "Yes," she said, while I gently, ever so gently, passed the jar into the care of Lady Clarence. She clutched it to her chest in an instant, hiding it underneath her coat. No matter who would ingest the poison, for my loyalties were not as rigid as Nella's, I could not help the pride that swelled within me on account of the many hours that went into the preparation of it. I did not recall ever being so proud not even after composing lengthy letters on behalf of Mrs. Amwell. Lady Clarence passed a blank note to Nella. I could not see how much, nor did I particularly care. As soon as she turned to leave, Nella cleared her throat. "The party is still tonight?" she asked. In her voice was a glimmer of hope, and I suspected that she prayed the whole affair had been canceled on account of the weather. "Would I have rushed over here in the rain if it was not?" Lady Clarence retorted. "Oh, don't be so foul about it," she said, seeing the look on Nella's face. "You're not the only one stirring into Miss Blackwell's liquor." She paused, pursing her lips. "I only pray she drinks this quickly, so we may put this all to an end." Nella closed her eyes as though the words sickened her. After Lady Clarence left, Nella walked slowly to where I sat at the table, lowered herself into the chair, and pulled her register close to her. She dipped her quill into the ink with a slowness I had not seen plague her before, as if the burden of the preceding hour had at last caught up to her. To think of the countless poisonous remedies she had dispensed, and yet this single one lay so heavy on her heart, I could not understand it. "Nella," I began, "you mustn't feel so bad. She would have ruined you had we not made the beetles for her." Nella had done nothing wrong in my eyes. Indeed, she had just saved countless lives, my own included. How did she not see it? Nella paused at my words, the quill in her hand, but without replying she placed the nib to the parchment and began to write. "Miss Birkwell, mistress to, cousin of, the Lord Clarence, Canthrides, February 9th, 1791, on account of his wife, the Lady Clarence." On the last mark she held the nib to the paper and exhaled, and I felt sure tears were imminent. Finally, she set the quill on its side, and a gentle roll of thunder rumbled somewhere outside. She turned to me, her eyes dark. "Dear child, it is that." She hesitated, considering her words. "It is that I have never had this feeling before." I began to tremble, as if a chill had just entered the room. What feeling? A feeling that something is about to go terribly wrong. In the quiet moments that followed, for I knew not how to reply to this frightening statement, I grew convinced that some nameless, unseen evil haunted us both. Could the spirit of Mr. Amwell have begun to haunt her too? My eyes fell on the worn burgundy book, still resting at the side of the table, the Book of Magic. Nella had said the book was meant for midwives and healers, but the inscription inside the back cover noted the address of the bookshop where it originated, a place where I might find more volumes of the same subject matter. If my fear of Mr. Amwell's spirit was reason enough to visit the shop, Nella's sense of impending doom was reason to make haste. The muffled sound of rain continued. The storm had not let up. If Nella did indeed throw me out, I would be passing a long, wet night in the slick streets of London. I would not return to the Amwell's house, not yet, and I doubted I had the bravery to sneak into a stranger's shed, as Nella liked to do. "I intend to visit the bookshop in the morning, once the rain is ended," I told her, pointing to the magic book. She raised an eyebrow at me, a skeptical look I was getting to know well. "And you still intend to seek a remedy to remove spirits from the house?" I nodded yes, and Nella made a small grunting noise, then stifled a yawn with her hand. "Little Eliza, it is time for you to go." She stepped closer to me, pity in her eyes. "You ought to return to the Amwell's house. I know you fear it greatly, but I assure you your fright is needless. Perhaps you step through the door and declare that you have returned. Any remnant of Mr. Amwell's spirit, real or imagined, will be released, and your heavy heart with it." I stared at her speechless. I had known all along that a dismissal was possible, but as she now declared it so, I could hardly believe that she had the gall to send me away so easily, and into the rain at that. I grounded more beetles than she did, after all. She could not have done any of this without me. I stood from my chair, my chest hot and thumping, and felt the childish sting of tears forming. "You do not want to see me again?" I stammered, letting a sob come forth, for I realized all at once that I was not sad about being banished from this place, as I was about never seeing my new friend again. At least I knew she was not made of stone, for Nella stood from her own chair, shuffled towards me, and wrapped me in a tight embrace. "I do not wish you a life of goodbyes, as the one I have lived." She brushed away my stray hair with the back of her hand. "But you are unspoiled, child, and I am not the kind of company you want to keep. Go on now, please." She took the magic book from the table and placed it in my hands. Then she abruptly pulled away from me, walked to the hearth, and did not look at me again. But as I stepped towards the hidden door and away from her forever, I could not help but glance back once more. Nella's body was bowed into the warmth of the fire, as though she might herself fall into it, and amid her haggled breaths, I was sure I also heard her weeping. Eliza, February 10th, 1791. I awoke upon a clear morning, and the sound of a carriage rushing by, its iron wheels screeching against the cobblestone road. I slept a street away from Nella's shop, in a protected crevice at the back of Bartlett's Passage. It was damper and less comfortable than the shed we stayed in, which I had rested 2 nights ago, but still better than my own cot back at the haunted Amwell's house. As soon as I woke, I clenched my teeth, waiting to see if the bloody belly pains had returned, if Mr. Amwell's spirit, no longer fooled, had made its way back to me. But that was not the case. The pains have now stayed away for a full day, and the trickle of blood reduced to almost nothing. And though I was grateful for it, I felt sure it was because Mr. Amwell lay in wait for me elsewhere. The idea of it angered me. He may have been master over me in days past, but it was not so any longer. I was not his toy, his plaything in death. I thought, too, of Lady Clarence's dinner party last evening. If all went as planned, Miss Birkwell should be dead. A frightening vision, but I remember what Nella told me about betrayal and vengeance as a medicine. Perhaps now, without the unwelcome presence of Miss Birkwell, Lady Clarence would find a way to tend her marriage and make a baby. Unsteady on my feet, I lifted myself from the ground and pressed down my skirts, which were grimy and in need of a wash. My hand brushed over the book inside my gown's pocket, the Book of Magic. Locating the address within was my most pressing task, for I had little else in which to hope, and no other way to rid the Amwell house of ghosts. I began to make my way to the bookshop on Basing Lane. A night of poor sleep had left me feeling wild like an animal. My hands shook, and a headache beat behind my eyes as the people near me moved in a watery haze. Messenger boys raced their carts against one another, fishmongers waved away the gulls, and an elderly man slapped the rear of his goat with a flimsy reed. As my toes pushed uncomfortably against my tight shoes, I could not ignore the momentary temptation of returning home, or even to the servants' registry office, where Mrs. Amwell first found me. I was 100 times more desirable now than I was then. I was literate for one. I could read and write, and had been employed by a wealthy family. Surely my skills would be valued elsewhere, in a home not teeming with unsettled spirits. I thought on this as I walked to the magic bookshop, but the idea quickly lost its hold as I considered the many reasons that I could not bear run away, not least of which was my devotion to Mrs. Amwell. She would return from Norwich in a few weeks' time, and by then I would hope to rid the house of Mr. Amwell and Johanna altogether. Besides, I could not imagine any other girl writing my mistress's letters. I felt a very special task reserved only for me. And a spirit could move, too. If the spirit of Mr. Amwell was able to seize me and follow me to Nella's shop, what was to stop him from haunting me all over London? Even leaving the city and returning to Swindon would not solve this, for there was no such thing as to escape from something that could float through walls. If I could not run from his spirit, I must find a way to dispel it. Mr. Amwell's spirit seemed all that mattered to me, so I was pleased finally to come upon Basing Lane, and I hoped to find the bookshop without any trouble. But my joy didn't last long. My eye passed from one store shop to another, a haberdashery and a bakery among others, and I frowned. The bookshop was not there. I walked another block, retraced my steps, and even looked for the shop across the street. As I searched, I felt plagued by endless discomfort. Tears prickled my eyes, frigid air burning my throat, a blister stinging and wet at the bottom of my foot. Walking again to the end of Basing Lane, the whistle of the wind rushing between the buildings caught my attention. Set back from the lane was a shoulder-width alley, and to one side of this was a building with a wooden sign, "Shop of Books and Babbles." I gasped. The bookshop, which I had walked right past several times, was tucked behind another storefront, as though it meant to disguise itself. If Nella were here, she would have been disappointed that I had not unraveled the mystery sooner. I placed my hand on the doorknob and stepped into the shop. It was not a large place, about the same as Mr. Amwell's drawing room, and it was deserted save a single young man at the counter, his face buried in the spine of a thick book. This gave me a moment to take in my surroundings, which consisted of several shelves of dusty children's trinkets and trifles at the front of the store, and a small area of books at the back behind the store attendant. The shop was humid and smelled of yeast, probably on account of the bread bakery nearby. I closed the door and the bell jingled softly. The attendant looked up at me over his glasses, eyes widening. "May I help you?" His voice cracked on the last word. He was young, only a few years older than me. "The books," I said, motioning to the shelves. "May I browse them?" He nodded, then returned his attention to his book. I crossed the room in only 4 or 5 strides. As I stepped closer to the shelves, I saw that each shelf had a small sign identifying the subject. Eagerly I read them: history, medical arts, and philosophy. I scanned quickly, wondering if the books on midwife magic might have come from the medical arts section, or if there might also be a shelf on books on the occult. I made my way to a second case of books. Squatting low to better read the sign at the bottom of the bookshelves, I let out a gasp. There, at the very bottom, on a single half shelf, was a sign that read Magical Arts. There were also a dozen or so volumes on the subject, and I intended to inspect them all. I began with the book on the far left, letting it fall open in my hands, but I cringed at the images printed on the first few pages. Large blackbirds with massive swords through their hearts, triangles and circles in variety of strange patterns, and a long passage written in a language I could not understand. I carefully placed it back on the shelf, hoping for better luck. The next book was half the size, both in height and width, with a soft sand-colored binding. I turned several pages until I found the title, printed in a small but even font: Spells for the Modern Household. I was pleased to find that it appeared written entirely in English. No strange symbols in this one, and the first few pages revealed a wide assortment of everyday recipes, although not the sort required to make a pudding or a stew. Elixir to extract child's tendency to lie. Brew to assign infant's gender in utero. Tincture to create great wealth within a fortnight. Brew to reduce age in the woman's body. On and on they read, each stranger than the last, but I felt it possible that here within this book I might locate something useful. I found a more comfortable seated position and tucked my legs underneath me. I continued to read each and every recipe, sure not to overlook a single one, and I searched especially for anything in reference to spirits or ghosts. Concoction, to erase memory, specific or general. Filter, to instill affection in object of desire, even intimate. Elixir, for restoring breath to the deceased infant's lungs. I paused, bumps forming on my skin, as I felt a warm breath against the back of my neck. My own mother used that spell, came the young voice, mere inches behind me. Ashamed of the book in my hands, I snapped it shut. Sorry, he continued, his voice backing away from me. I didn't mean to frighten you. It was the shop boy. I turned to face him, seeing now more clearly his pimples on his chin and the roundness of his eyes. It's okay, I mumbled, the book lying limp in my hand. A witch, then, are you? He asked, the sly grin at the edge of his lips. I shook my head, embarrassed. No, just curious is all. Satisfied with my response, he nodded. I'm Tom Pepper. Pleasure to have you in my shop. Thank you, I muttered. I'm Eliza Fanning. And though I wanted badly to open the book once again and continue my search, I found that Tom, up close, was not so unpleasant to my eyes. He glanced down at the book. I wasn't lying, you know. That book was my mother's. So your mother was a witch, then? I was only teasing, but he didn't laugh, as I'd hoped he would. She was not a witch, no, but she lost her babies, one after the other, 9 of them before me, and in her desperation, she used the elixir on this page you just closed. May I? He motioned to the book, waited for me to nod, and gingerly took the book from my lap. He flipped to the page I had just been reading and pointed to it. Elixir for restoring breath to the deceased infant's lungs, he read aloud. Then looking up at me, he added, according to my father, I was born dead, like all the others. This spell brought me back to life. He tensed, as though the revelation pained him to share. If my mother was still alive, she could tell you about it herself. I'm sorry, I whispered, our faces close. Wetting his lips, he looked from the front of the shop. This is my father's shop. He opened it after my mother died. The front, where you came in, those babbles all belonged to her, things she collected for the babies over the years, most of it never touched or used. I could not help but ask, when did your mother die? Soon after I was born, later that week, in fact. I covered my mouth with my hand. So you were the first baby that lived, and then she died, not... Tom picked his fingernail. Some say that it was a curse or magic, why books like this one you're holding should be burned. I frowned, not understanding what he meant, and Tom went on. The curse of magic, they believe, is that for every reward there is a great loss. For every spell that goes right, there is something else in the real world, natural world, that goes terribly wrong. I looked at the book in his hands. It would take a great while, a couple of hours at least, to read every spell within, and even then, who knew if I would find something that might prove useful? Do you believe in the curse of magic? I asked. Tom hesitated. I don't know what I believe. I only know this book is very special to me. I would not be here without it. He then set the book gently on my lap. I would like you to have it. You may take it for free if you'd like. Oh, I can pay you, surely. I reached a sweaty hand into my pocket, fumbling for a coin. He put out a hand, but did not touch me. I'd rather it go to someone like you than a complete stranger. At once I felt hot, almost unwell, as my stomach turned loops inside of me. Thank you, I said, hugging the book close to my chest. Just promise one thing, he said. If you find a spell in there that works, it will be 2 for 2. Promise me you will stop by and tell me of it. I promise, I said, untangling my tingling legs to stand. and though I did not want to go, I had no reason to stay. Making my way towards the door, I turned back a final time. And if I try a spell and it does not work? This seemed to take him by surprise. If the spell does not work, well, then the book cannot be trusted, and you must come back inside and exchange it for another. His eyes glinted mischievously. So either way, then, I'll be seeing you. Good day, Eliza. I walked out the door in a dizzy haze, feeling a strange new feeling, one I had not felt in my 12 years of life. It was foreign and nameless to me, but I felt sure it was not hunger or fatigue, for neither of those things have ever made me step so light and my face so warm. I hurried west, eventually walking along the south edge of St. Paul's churchyard, to find a bench in the soft, quiet frontage of the church, a place where I could read every single spell and, perhaps, find one to take to the animal house today. With all my might, I wished to find the perfect spell inside this book of magic, something not only to remove spirits and mend all that was broken, but something that would permit me to share the news with Tom Pepper as soon as possible. Nella, February 10th, 1791. The demon who decided long ago to crawl its way through my body, crunching and curling my bones, hardening my knuckles, wrapping its fingers around my wrists and hips, had begun finally to move upward and into my skull. And why wouldn't it? The skull is made of bone, just as what might be found in the hands or the chest. It is as susceptible as anything else. For whereas this demon inflicted tightness and heat on my fingers and wrists, in my skull it took another form, an agitation, a tremor, a persistent tap, tap, tap inside me. Something was approaching. I felt sure of it. It would come within me, my bones melting into a single hardened mass, leaving me crippled on the floor of my shop? Or would it come from outside, dangling in front of me like a rope at the gallows? I missed Eliza the moment I sent her away, and now, as I picked rosemary leaves from the stem, the lack of her company was as sticky and sharp as the residue on my fingers. It had been cruel of me to dismiss her, no matter how petty I considered her fears. I did not truly believe the Amwell house swarmed with ghosts, as Eliza seemed to think, but did my beliefs carry any weight if I was not the one sleeping at that place? I wonder how she felt returning to the Amwell house last night with a gown made filthy by our efforts and the gloves worn through and a silly book on magic that couldn't possibly remove the ghosts that only exist in her colorful imagination. I hoped in time she would learn to replace such fanciful thoughts with real matters of the heart, a husband to love, children to feed, all the things I would never have for myself. And I prayed Eliza woke this morning anew, never to think of me again, for as much as I missed her pleasant chatter, longing was something which I was well acquainted. I would manage just fine. I had made my way through 4 stems of rosemary when there was a sudden commotion in the storage room. A panicked cry, then the incessant hammering of a fist against the hidden wall of shelves. I peeked out through the hole to see Lady Clarence, her eyes wide as saucers. Given my heavy sense of foreboding over the course of the preceding day, I could not say I was all that surprised by her unexpected arrival. Still, her manner alarmed me. "Nella," she shouted, her hands flying wildly about in front of her. "Hello, are you in there?" I opened the door quickly and ushered her inside, no longer taken aback by the untarnished silver buckle on her shoes and the scallop edges of her taffeta dress. But as I gazed over her, I noticed the material at the bottom of her skirt was smudged, as though she traveled part of the way on foot. "I have not more than 10 minutes," she cried, nearly falling into my arms. and when I left, it was under pretense, something about the estate. I frowned at her nonsensical words, confusion surely writ all over my face. "Oh, something has gone terribly wrong," she said. "God, I will never—" As she dabbed at her eyes, choking over her words, my mind raced with possibilities. Had she accidentally disposed of the powder? Had she managed to rub some of it in her eye or on her lips? I searched her face for blisters, pockets of pus, but saw none. "Shh," I said, quieting her. "What has happened?" "The beetles," she hiccuped, like she had just sucked something down that was bitter. "The beetles, it all went awry." I could hardly believe my ears. Did the beetles cause no harm? I was sure that Eliza and I had gone to the correct field and harvested the blister beetles, rather than their harmless, bluish cousin. Yet it had been so dark, and how could I know for sure? I should have tested a few of them, for the familiar burn upon the skin before roasting them. "She is still alive?" I asked her, my hand on my throat. "I assure you, they were meant to be fatal." "Oh," she laughed, and twisted a grin upon her face, fat tears spilling down her cheeks. I could not make sense of it. "She is very much alive." My heart surged for a moment, intermingled with the dismay that my poison failed. I was greatly relieved, too, that a woman did not die at my hands. Perhaps this gave me another chance to change Lady Clarence's mind. But as I considered this, a knot formed in my belly. What if Lady Clarence thought I'd given her a false potion? What if she meant to reveal my shop to authorities, as she had originally threatened? Instinctively, I took a step back towards my register, but she went on. It was him, my husband. She let out a wail and covered her face. "He is dead. Lord Clarence is dead." My mouth dropped open. "How?" I stammered. "Did you not watch your lady's maid give it to the mistress?" "Don't blame this on me, woman," she snapped. "My maid put it in the fig dessert liqueur, just as planned." Lady Clarence fell into the chair and took a steady breath as she unraveled her story for me. It was after dinner. Miss Blackwell sat some ways away from me and my husband. I watched from across the room as Miss Birkwell took a single sip, of the fig liqueur from her pretty crystal glass. Within seconds she reached her hand to her throat. She began to cross and uncross her legs. I could see it all, Nella. I could see it so clearly, what was happening to her, that I began to fear that someone might catch me looking, and I turned to my friend to the left and began to speak with her. She told me all about her recent trip to Lionel, and on she went, until after a short while I dared take a look at Miss Birkwell again. Lady Clarence sucked in a breath, her throat rattling. But she was gone, and my husband too, and the crystal glass of liqueur with them. I could not believe I'd missed it, that he'd stepped away with her in that short time, and I had missed it. I was sure in that moment I would never lay eyes on her face again, and I imagined the two of them running off to his library or the back of the carriage house for a final time. I took comfort in this, you know. As she told her story, I remained still, envisioning it all before me. The dinner table of pudding and evening gowns, the fig liqueur, the fine green powder hiding in the shadows of it. "But then I grew anxious," Lady Clarence continued, "thinking perhaps it was all happening a bit too fast, and I worried that in her state of lust she must have forgotten the liqueur altogether and not drank the required amount." She paused, looking around. "Might I have some wine to calm my nerves, please?" I rushed to my cupboard, poured her a glass, and set it in front of her. I began to panic, Nella, and considered searching them out, confronting them, asking her to join the ladies in the drawing-room. Instead, I remained frozen at my seat, while my friend continued to spout on about her trip, and I prayed that at any moment my husband would come into the room telling me something terrible had happened to her, his dear cousin. Lady Clarence looked down at the floor and suddenly wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Then I saw a ghost approaching from the corridor, the ghost of Miss Birkwell. Oh, how I nearly cried out. I stifled it, thank heavens. How strange that would have seemed to the dinner guest. But I soon learned it was no ghost. It was her in the flesh and blood. I knew it by the mole on her neck, red and inflamed, as though my husband's lips had just been there. A small moan left her throat. She came out with such a look of fright. She is just a young thing, and so small. She nearly collapsed into the arms of the first person she saw, Lord Clarence's brother, who was a physician. Immediately he rushed down the corridor from which she had just came. There were people everywhere, running this way and that, in the complete uproar. From down the hall, near the library, I heard shouts and cries, something about his heart having stopped, and I rushed to see him. He was still clothed, thank God. As I suspected, on a small table next to the chase was an empty crystal glass. He must have drank the entire thing. Oh, Nella, I did not know what would happen so quickly. I told you half the jar would kill him in an hour. How much was in the glass? The look of anguish on Lady Clarence's face fell away, transformed into something like guilt. I believe my maid used all that was in the jar. She let out a cry, slumping forward in her chair, while I grasped in disbelief. It was no wonder he died within moments. But Lady Clarence seemed as distraught about Miss Birkwell's behavior after the fact as she was about her dead husband. Would you believe that as I sat there looking at his dead body, Miss Birkwell approached me and placed her arms around me and began to cry. "Oh, Lady Clarence," the girl wailed, fig fruit stinking on her breath. He was like a father to me, and I thought it a sick thing to say, and I had half the nerve to ask her if she'd like to prig her own father, too. Lady Clarence let out a final hideous laugh, her eyes sunken, as though spent from the telling of her story. "And now I am the widow of a wealthy man, and I will never want for anything except the thing that I want most, which is a child." How utterly bitter on the tongue, even as I say it. I will never have a child, Nella, never. A statement with which I could relate to, but yet something about her story began to worry me. "You say his brother, a physician, was the first to administer to him?" She nodded. "Yes, a kindly man. He declared my husband dead not 5 minutes after Miss Birkwell came into the dining room, in a mad fright." "And he did not seem worried by the empty glass sitting next to the chase?" Lady Clarence shook her head, sure of herself. "He asked about it, to which Miss Birkwell immediately claimed it was her own. She said they'd been in the library, so he could show her a newly acquired tapestry, as she claimed some recent interest in textile arts, and she could hardly reveal that he shared of her drink, could she? Then it would be clear that they were doing more than just enjoying his art." "And the jar?" I asked. "You hid it somewhere or destroyed it?" "Oh yes, my lady's maid put it on a shelf at the very back of the cellar. Only the cook had any reason to go digging back there. I'll dispose of it as soon as I am able to sneak down there, tonight perhaps." I exhaled a small relief, grateful that the canister remained hidden. But even if it was found, not all would be lost. This was precisely why the jar and vials about my shop were naked, save for the small engraving of a bear. "Though it is not traceable to me," I urged. "Best to get rid of it immediately." "Most certainly," she said. "Anyhow, I thought it curious you would have engravings on the jar." She delicately wiped her nose, composing herself. "A lifetime of rigid manners could not be so easily forgotten." "Just that of a little bear," I said, pointing to a small canister on a nearby shelf. "Like that one." So many jars are similar in appearance. Imagine if someone were to administer a drop from the wrong bottle, and that wrong person. I stopped myself, ashamed of what had nearly slipped from my tongue, given the story she had just told. But she didn't seem to notice as she frowned and walked to the shelf. She shook her head. My jar had this image, but there was nothing else. She lifted the jar and turned it to the side. No, these aren't the same. My jar had something on the other side of it. Words, I'm sure of it. A faint rumble crawled through my belly, and I let out a nervous laugh. No, you must be mistaken. What words would I dare place on a jar of poison? I assure you, Lady Clarence said, there was something else written on it. Jagged letters, as though it had been etched into the clay by hand. A scratch, perhaps? Or dirt? Just rubbish, I suggested, the pressure in my stomach rising upward into my chest. No, she insisted, irritation rising in her voice. I know words when I see them. She threw me an exasperated glance and returned the jar to its shelf. Though I was listening to her words, I did not fully hear them. The tap, tap, tap was too loud, and the story why Lady Clarence had just shared no longer seemed her crisis alone, like I had just sipped from the crystal glass of cantharides myself. I choked out her name. Eliza. A memory began to crystallize. Yesterday afternoon, just before Lady Clarence arrived to retrieve the poison, Eliza had selected the jar that would hold the poison. I hadn't paid any attention to the jar she selected, for anything within easy reach were etched with the Bear logo and nothing more. Only those deep in the back of my mother's cupboard were marked otherwise. Eliza, yes, where is she today? Lady Clarence asked, unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I must find her immediately, I gasped. The cupboard. But I could not speak another word, much less explain myself to Lady Clarence, for I could not think about anything except making haste to Warwick Lane, where I could find the Amwell estate. Oh, how I prayed she was there. And you, I said to Lady Clarence, go now, get the jar immediately, and bring it to— Your eyes are that of an animal, she cried. Whatever is the matter? But I was already moving out of the door, as she followed close behind. As I stepped outside, I did not feel the cold against my skin, or the tightness of my shoes against my swollen ankles. Ahead, a flock of blackbirds took flight. Even they were scared of me. At some point, Lady Clarence went on her way to retrieve the jar. I prayed. I continued onward, rushing up Ludgate Street, the cathedral rising far above me. The Amwell estate was very close now, only a couple of blocks ahead. As I neared my turn-off to Warwick Lane, I spotted a small, shrouded figure on a bench ahead, near the churchyard. Were my eyes playing a trick on me? My heart surged as I observed a light, playful manner in which this mysterious figure turned the pages of a book in her lap. I was close to the Amwell house. It would not be out of the realm of possibility to encounter Eliza at any moment. My hopes were soon confirmed. It was undoubtedly her. Eliza, I shouted when we were only mere meters apart. She jerked her head towards me. Her smile fell, and she clutched the book close to her chest. It was not the book I gave her. This one was smaller, and the cover was a lighter color. Eliza, oh, do listen to me, for it is very urgent. I reached for her, bringing her into a hesitant embrace, yet she remained stiff in my arms. There was something odd with her. She was not pleased to see me. This morning I had wished to be a distant memory of hers, yet now I find myself offended by it. And what of her smile a moment ago? What had happened recently that it left her in such a gleeful state? You must return to the shop with me, child, for there is something I need to show you. In fact, I needed her to show me from exactly which cupboard she withdrew the jar from. Her gaze was flat, unreadable, but her words were not. You sent me away, remember? I do remember, but I also remember telling you that I feared something terrible would happen, and it has. I want to tell you all about it, but I glanced at a man walking close by and lowered my voice. I cannot do so here. Come with me now. I need your help. She clutched the book tighter to her chest. Yes, fine, she mumbled, glancing at the dark clouds building overhead. We made our way back to the shop, Eliza silent next to me, and I sensed she was not only confused by my stealing her away, but irritated that I had seized her attention from whatever she busied herself with a moment ago. As we drew closer to the shop, I hoped to find Lady Clarence inside, returned with the cursed jar in her hand, and indeed, if that was the scene we came upon, my question for Eliza would be unnecessary. But could I really send her away again so soon? It was of no matter, for the shop lay empty, and Lady Clarence had not yet returned. I sat down at the table, feigning calm, and wasted not a moment. Do you remember putting Lady Clarence's powder into a container? Yes, ma'am, Eliza said quickly, her hands neatly folded in her lap, as though she was a stranger. Just as you said, I retrieved a proper-sized jar from the cupboard. Show me, I said, a small tremble in my voice. I followed Eliza 1, 2, 3 steps across the room, and she crawled onto her knees and opened the lower cupboard and leaned in a little. She reached to the very back, and I clutched my belly, fearing I might vomit. Back here, she said, her voice distorted as the sound echoed inside the wooden cabinet. There was another one just like it, I think. I closed my eyes, terror finally rising in me and seizing my throat, my tongue. For this cupboard, the one in which Eliza now found herself halfway inside, was full of my mother's things, including treasures with which I could not bear to part, old remedies of which I had no need, and yes, several of her old containers that I knew for certain were engraved with the address of her once reputable apothecary shop. The address of this shop, which was not so reputable anymore. Eliza's tiny body slithered out of the cupboard, and in her hand was a cream-colored jar, about 4 inches high, one of a pair of 3 back alley, hand engraved onto the side of it. Without her saying another word, I knew its mate was in the cellar of Lady Clarence's stately home. A familiar sour burn rose in my throat, and I placed my hand on the cupboard to steady myself. It was like this, Eliza said, her voice hardly more than a whisper, her eyes downcast. The one with the powder looked like this. She slowly, bravely looked up at me. Have I done something wrong, Nella? Though my hands itched with the urge to strangle her, what did the girl know? It was a terrible misunderstanding. The room was full of shells. And was it not my fault for asking her to choose a canister? Was it not my fault for bringing the girl into this shop of poisons in the first place? So yes, I resisted the urge to slap her flushed face, and instead, I placed my arm around her. Did you not read the jar, girl? Did you not see the words on it? She began to cry, and sucked in a breath of snot and tears. It hardly looks like words, she hiccuped. See here, just a few messy etches. I cannot even properly read what it says. And while she was correct, the impression was old, nearly illegible. It remained, nevertheless, a terrible oversight on her part. But you know words from a picture, don't you? I said. She nodded slightly. Oh, I am so sorry, Nella. What does this say? She squinted as she attempted to read the words on the jar. I slowly traced the fading outline of the words, running my finger along the fat loops of the 3 and the letter B. 3B, she paused, thinking. 3 back alley. She set down the jar and crumbled into my arms. Oh, can you ever forgive me, Nella? Her shoulders heaved as she sobbed uncontrollably, tears dropping to the floor. If you are arrested, it will be all my fault, she said through her hiccups. Shh, I whispered. Shh, as I rocked her forwards and back. I was reminded of baby Beatrice. I closed my eyes and put my chin on Eliza's head and thought of how my own mother had done this after she had grown very ill, how she had comforted me when I was sure her end was near. I had cried so hard with my face muzzled into her neck. I will not be arrested, I whispered to Eliza, though I did not entirely believe it. Lord Clarence was dead, and the weapon, with my address on it, was still in the cellar. The tap, tap, tap had not left me. The demon in my skull was not yet at rest. I continued to rock Eliza, back and forth, hushing her tears away, thinking of the lies my own mother told me about her illness and the severity of it all after she fell sick. She had sworn she would live many more years, and yet she had died in only 6 days. As a result, I had spent a lifetime wrestling with the abruptness of the grief, the incompleteness of it. Why didn't my mother tell me the truth and use her last days to prepare me for a lifetime alone? Eliza's dewy tears began to dry. She hiccuped once, twice, then her breathing slowed as I continued to rock her back and forth. All will be well, I whispered, so quietly that I could hardly hear it myself. All will be well. 2 decades after my mother's death, I found myself reassuring a child exactly as my mother had reassured me. But to what end? Why did we go to such lengths to protect the fragile minds of children? We only robbed them of the truth and the chance to grow numb to it before it arrived with a hard knock on the door. To see what happens next to Nella and Eliza, be looking for Part 5 in The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Penner.